So a couple of days ago, there was actually somewhat of a political earthquake here in Sweden when the Sweden Democrats made a joint proposal with traditional center-right parties and the Liberals. What made this proposal surprising was that it was about migration, which is clearly one of the biggest issues in Sweden that has divided the political class for many, many years now. Parties were forced to come to an agreement about this in the first place because apparently the main law regarding immigration is actually expiring here in Sweden. And of course, the Sweden Democrats usually don't agree with the Liberals on many things, especially not migration. But the fact that they're talking seems like Sweden is taking a little bit of a step in the right direction. The details of the proposal are frankly pretty boring, but what struck me most about their agreement is how far behind Sweden actually is when it comes to the immigration debate, especially compared to the rest of Europe. One of the biggest topics in the proposal was about passing a basic Swedish language test as a requirement for getting a residential permit. So exciting. The government meant to include this proposal way back, but withdrew it in the last second years ago. So now, again, some years later, the opposition is still trying to get this included. For my international audience out there, exactly, you heard it correctly. Apparently, knowing Swedish or a basic level of Swedish is still controversial for the Swedish left in Sweden. And before you're coming for me, telling me that I should follow suit by also learning Swedish, be assured I am actually taking classes 2 times a week. But all jokes aside, Sweden, whether you like to hear this or not, when it comes to migration, you are really past the point of talking about language courses. Since the end of the Second World War, Europe has seen 5 different waves of mass migration, with the largest one, of course, being the one that happened with the migrant crisis in 2015. Civil unrest in countries like Syria and Libya, fueled by foreign intervention, which actually ended up in favor of radical Islamists, led millions of people to cross borders into our continent. According to Eurostat, almost 4 million people requested asylum in Europe between 2015 and 2018. And as we all know, some years later now, these people, exactly like the labor migrants who came to Europe in the 70s and the 80s, aren't actually leaving. Millions of people from mostly Middle Eastern and African descent have migrated to Europe, most of whom were young Muslim men, and apparently they're here to stay. And we are feeling the effects of it every day. Social cohesion deteriorated, our sense of home deteriorated, and our safety deteriorated. And we, especially us younger Europeans, were never really asked if we wanted this. Did we have a say in whether our politicians should have had the mandate to almost irreversibly change the way that our continent looks in one single generation?
Diversity is now, in some parts of Europe, seen as a threat. Diversity comes with challenges. But diversity is humanity's destiny. There is not going to be, even in the remotest places of this planet, a nation that will not see diversity in its future. That's where humanity is heading. And those politicians trying to sell to their electorates a society that is exclusively composed of people from one culture are trying to portray a future based on a past that never existed. Therefore, that future will never be. Europe will be diverse. Like all other parts of the world, we'll be diverse. The only question is, how do we deal with that diversity? And my answer to that is by ensuring that our values determine how we deal with diversity and not giving up our values to refuse diversity. That will bring us down as a society. If we don't get this right, I truly believe Europe will not remain the Europe we've built. Europe will not remain a place of peace and freedom for very long.
Well, clearly, the answer is no. This clip that you just saw of Frans Timmermans, who is actually now the second most powerful person in the EU and the mastermind behind all of the European climate hysteria, was actually taken in 2016, the year after the peak of the migrant crisis, of course. And you heard the man. Every part of the globe needs to become diverse. It's humanity's fate, and Europe is first. And if we won't, well, according to Frans Timmermans, we'll have war. That doesn't just sound like a threat, it is one. Our political establishment decided upon this mass immigration for us, and there was nothing democratic about it. Listen, already in 1999, 86% of Dutch were in favor of measures to actually halt the influx of migrants and asylum seekers coming to our country. And in 2008, 56% deemed mass migration to be the largest mistake made in Dutch history, ever to have been made. And this was the public opinion even far before anybody could imagine the huge numbers of immigrants that Europe would be taking in 2015. In that year alone, German Chancellor Angela Merkel brought 1.3 million refugees to Germany. But how has "Wir schaffen das" really worked out for Europe? Well, it's pretty clear that "Wir schaffen das gar nicht." And Merkel knew it. She knew we wouldn't. In 2010, it was actually her who said that multiculturalism has, and I quote, utterly failed, and that the idea of people from different cultural backgrounds living happily, and I again quote, side by side, didn't work. Yet, when Merkel was confronted with her references to her country's dark past in 2015, she made the decision to subject her country, and therefore the entirety of Europe, to millions of migrants to come. The results have been flat out disastrous, with the spike of Islamic terrorism on European soil, of course, being the most intense and immediate effect. According to Europol's numbers, 87 Islamic terrorist attacks were carried out in Europe between the summer of 2014, which is when the Islamic State proclaimed its caliphate, till 2019. Up until not so long ago, it was totally impossible in our politically correct climate to suggest that there was a correlation between immigration and terrorism. And while Sweden is getting all excited about the fact that they'll probably have a compulsory language course now for immigrants in 2025, I believe, the debate in France, the country that has been hit hardest by Islamic terrorism and arguably also by Islamization as a whole, is, let's just say, a little bit further ahead. For example, this week, 20 retired French generals have written a powerful letter to President Macron stating that France, and I quote, will head towards civil war if Macron cannot stop Islamists from disintegrating society. The letter, written by a retired officer, was signed by around 20 generals, 100 senior officers, and more than 1,000 other soldiers. And this letter was sent to Macron as a plea for the return of honor and duty within the political class. Let me translate and read you some of the segments from the letter. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen of the government, members of parliament, the situation is serious. France is in danger. Several deadly perils threaten her. And even in retirement, we remain soldiers of France and cannot in the present circumstances remain indifferent to the fate of our beautiful country. Our honor today lies in the denunciation of the disintegration which strikes our homeland. This disintegration that is happening because of Islamists and the suburban hordes in our country is detaching large parts of the nation and turning it into territory that is subjected to dogmas that are contrary to our Constitution. This is no longer the time to procrastinate. Otherwise, in the near future, a civil war will put an end to this growing chaos, and the deaths for which you will bear the responsibility will number in the thousands. End of the quotes. If you want to read the rest of the letter, because it's much longer than what I've just read to you, it has been published by Valeurs Actuelles. So again, while Sweden's issues with immigration and terrorism aren't small at all, you guys are still talking about language courses, whilst France is talking about the possibility of there being a civil war in the near future as a result of mass migration. And this very strong stance against immigration and terrorism is becoming, rightfully so, quite a mainstream talking point in France now. Listen closely to what Philippe de Villiers, a former member of the European Parliament, had to say on French TV.
Les Français voient bien qu'il y a un lien entre l'immigration et le terrorisme. L'immigration, on l'a dit longtemps, souvent, est le terreau de l'islam, qui est le terreau de l'islamisme, qui est le terreau du terrorisme. Je pèse mes mots, ce que je vais dire est très grave. Ceux qui refusent de faire un lien entre l'immigration et le terrorisme ont du sang sur les mains, ce sont des collabos. Ce sont des collabos qui nous préparent à ce que Houellebecq a appelé la grande soumission. Et l'enjeu de la prochaine présidentielle, c'est ou bien on retrouve une politique de civilisation, ou bien on laisse le pays s'effondrer et l'aventure finir, l'aventure française. C'est ou la refrancisation ou l'aventure se termine.
He was very clear. People who by now still refuse to see a link between immigration and terrorism have what he calls blood on their hands and are even called collaborators. And I know that in maybe other parts of Europe this is an extremely strong stance, but could you really blame the French for worrying about this? In 2017, France counted 777 police reports of what they call violence gratuite. In English, this would translate into something like useless violence. And they counted these 777 reports not in a month, not in a week, but every single day. That comes down to a police report being filed of this unexpected and unnecessary violence every 2 minutes. Can you imagine how many of these cases that actually occur aren't reported? The problems with immigration, terrorism, and the rapidly changing demographics in Europe are undeniable to anybody who isn't locked up in an ivory tower. And as much as I am in favor of talk, clearly, this situation calls for action. Europe needs to put a halt to mass migration, and we need to start standing people back who have no right to be here. If we don't do it, the cost will be incredibly high. So we need to follow the example of Denmark and start sending refugees and migrants whose home countries are safe back home. We need to not be afraid of being called a racist for wanting Europe to stay European. Our cultures, traditions, and national identities are worth it. Actually, now that we're talking about the racism debate anyway, I want to talk to you about something before ending this episode in a form that's a little bit different. I want to do a little bit of a reaction video to something that I saw this week that absolutely baffled me. We'll be listening to a segment of an interview that aired on CBC News, which is Canada's largest broadcaster, with an author called Ben Philip, who just published a book called Sure, I'll Be Your Black Friend. Buckle up.
What would happen if there was a race war and what side you would be on. And you took it to a place that I just found really shocking and disturbing to read. Would you say a little bit about that?
Sure. Actually, fun fact, that section used to be so much longer. So thank you to my editor for condensing it. Mm-hmm. I'm a big Dungeons and Dragons person, so I went into advanced world building of what that race war could look like. Mm-hmm. And they were just like, no, maybe just half a page. Mm-hmm. It was ultimately just trying to take the state of the world to its logical conclusion. If we all have to sort of exist in this common land together and we can't get along and we can't heal and we can't try to understand each other, if it's always going to be us versus them, define the us, define the them, however you want, then...
Okay, whoa, wait a second. Okay, so I know that you guys at home, you've seen the quote that's on the screen right now, so you know what he's going to say at some point in this interview. And he's talking about healing. You're talking about healing and you're talking about define the we versus them however you want. He's talking about race war. You're talking about eventually, as we will see, possibly gassing white people, and you're saying define the us and the them. However, you've clearly, Ben Philip, you've clearly defined it. It's apparently you're talking about blacks versus whites. So how is that a healing message at all? It's again this Biden rhetoric that I hope nobody who's watching right now falls for. But this is, I have to say, it goes a little far. And also, one more thing. Dungeons and Dragons as your reference for advanced world building? Really? Really?
Then, I guess I was wrestling with the question that isn't the end result of that just all-out warfare? Like Game of Thrones style warfare?
Game of Thrones style warfare. Okay, so let me get this straight. This guy is in academia, or he says he's in academics. He writes a book, and he goes on, and he's like, the two references that he has for advanced world building and major warfare are Dungeons and Dragons and Game of Thrones. Like, again, two fantasy things. Do you have any connection to the real world at all, or to history? Maybe, you know, like you could have picked any world, any war for that matter that ever happened, but you choose to go for Game of Thrones. I feel like that kind of says something about your academic status.
And what does that look like? And I lived in that sort of straight thought for a few pages. And it was disturbing to write too, because I'm not a violent person. I love all my white friends.
Well, for people who haven't read the book, you write about, you say, I'll when this race war hits its crescendo, I'll gather you all into a beautifully decorated room under the pretense of unity. I'll give a speech to civility and all the good times we've shared. I'll smile as we raise our glasses to your good white health while the detonator blinks under the table, knowing the exits are locked and the air vents filled with gas. I mean, I'm a Jewish person, and grandparents survived the Holocaust. I can't tell you how it felt to read that sentiment. And I wanted to say to you that I'm so sorry that your experience of the world made you feel that way and made you feel compelled to write that.
Right. Okay, so right before you think that this cannot get any crazier, the woman who's actually interviewing him says she's obviously shocked by what he's saying. I mean, let's just repeat it one more time, right? He's talking about gathering all of his white friends into a room, a beautifully decorated room, under the pretense of unity, and then toasting to their good white health, and at the same time, a detonator is blinking and he's about to gas them. It's like really gruesome, you know. And then there is a Jewish woman in front of him interviewing this, reading this out loud, and her response is, I'm so shocked. I have two grandparents who survived the Holocaust. And then she goes, I'm so sorry the world made you feel this way. I'm like, what's there left to say, right? If this type of highly disgusting, like deeply hateful, violent rhetorics, if this is something that now a modern day Jewish woman who has had her parents survive the Holocaust listens to and says, I'm so sorry for you that the world made you feel this way. You're still the victim in all this. It's like, where are we heading? Really? Like, where are we heading? Yeah, well, food for thought, I would say. I mean, not a most positive way to end this video, I suppose, but I had to show you this because I saw it this week and it has been going in around my mind and I can't grasp it. So let's end on that note. This week, I hope that the episode's going to be a little bit more cheerful. We'll see. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. So this was another episode of Let's Talk About It. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to. And please leave a comment down below what you thought of this insane footage that we just shown you. Please let me hear your thoughts because I'm dying to hear them. And we'll see you in the next episode.